Either write something worth reading or do something worth writing. It is the year 1752, a humid June afternoon in Philadelphia. Thunder rumbles in the distance, and dark clouds gather over the city. While sensible citizens hurry indoors to escape the coming storm, a 46-year-old man and his 21-year-old son make their way to an open field carrying what appears to be a simple kite. But this is no ordinary kite, and this is no ordinary man. Attached to the kite is a sharp metal wire, a hemp string, a silk ribbon, and a metal key. The man knows the danger, knows that what he is about to attempt could kill him. Others in Europe who have tried similar experiments have already died, struck by lightning, their bodies left charred and smoking. But Benjamin Franklin is not deterred. He has a theory about the nature of lightning, about electricity, about the fundamental forces that govern the natural world, and he intends to prove it, even if it means standing in a thunderstorm with a device designed to attract the very thing most people flee from. This is Benjamin Franklin, and tonight we journey through the extraordinary life of America's first great scientist, its most beloved diplomat, one of its founding fathers, and perhaps its most fascinating character. A man who ran away from home at 17 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a few copper coins in his pocket, yet became one of the most famous people in the world. A printer who taught himself to be a scientist. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history and the remarkable lives that shaped our world. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. So settle in, perhaps with a warm drink, and prepare to walk the cobblestone streets of colonial Boston and Philadelphia. Chapter 1: The Boy from Milk Street. The house stands on Milk Street in Boston, a modest dwelling in the heart of a bustling colonial port city. It is here, on January 17, 1706, that Abiah Folger Franklin gives birth to her 8th child, a boy named Benjamin. He is the 15th of 17 children born to his father, Josiah Franklin, a tallow chandler and soap maker who had emigrated from England 2 decades earlier, seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity in the New World. The birth takes place on a Sunday, appropriately enough for a Puritan household, and before the day is out, the infant is carried across the street to the Old South Meeting House to be baptized, his soul claimed for Christ before the sun sets on his first day of life. This is the world into which Benjamin Franklin is born, a world where religion permeates every aspect of existence, where the Sabbath is kept strictly, where reading the Bible and attending sermon after sermon is not optional but required. Boston in 1706 is a city of about 7,000 souls, the largest town in British North America, a place of rigid Puritan values and growing commercial ambition. The streets are narrow and crooked, following the old cow paths rather than any rational plan, lined with wooden houses that crowd together, their second stories often jutting out over the street below. The streets smell of salt air and fish from the harbor, of wood smoke from countless chimneys, of the tallow and lye from shops like Josiah Franklin's, of horse manure and human waste that accumulate in the gutters, waiting for rain to wash them away. The harbor is the heart of the city's life, crowded with merchant ships and fishing boats, with sailors and dockhands speaking a babble of languages, with merchants haggling over cargoes of rum and molasses and timber. The waterfront is where fortunes are made and lost, where news from England and the other colonies arrives, where young men dream of adventure on the high seas. Church bells mark the rhythm of life, calling the faithful to worship multiple times each Sunday, reminding everyone that this is a community built on religious devotion as much as on trade. Young Benjamin grows up in this world, one child among many in a crowded household where pennies must be watched carefully and where hard work is not just valued, but essential for survival. His father is a skilled craftsman, but hardly wealthy, always calculating how to feed and clothe so many children, always aware that opportunities must be carefully allocated because there simply are not enough to go around. Josiah Franklin recognizes early that his youngest son possesses unusual intelligence. The boy learns to read at a remarkably young age, devouring any book he can get his hands on, showing a quickness of mind that sets him apart from his siblings. Hoping to channel this intelligence toward a respectable profession, Josiah sends 8-year-old Benjamin to the Boston Latin School, the finest school in the city, the training ground for ministers and community leaders. Benjamin excels at his studies, quickly rising to the top of his class, demonstrating such aptitude that he skips a grade. But after less than a year, Josiah withdraws him from the school. The official reason is financial. The tuition is simply beyond what a tallow chandler can afford for one child when 16 others need feeding. But perhaps there is another reason as well. Ministers in Puritan Boston live modestly, dependent on their congregations for support, and Josiah, for all his piety, wants better for his bright young son. Benjamin spends another year at a different school, George, Brownell's, where he excels at writing but struggles with arithmetic, a weakness that will haunt him in later years, though he will eventually master mathematics through self-study. At 10 years old, his formal education ends. 2 years of schooling, that is all the classroom learning Benjamin Franklin will ever receive. Yet, he will become one of the most learned men of his age, proving that education and schooling are not always the same thing. For the next 2 years, young Benjamin works in his father's shop, cutting wicks for candles, pouring tallow into molds, delivering finished products to customers around Boston. It is honest work, but tedious, repetitive, uninspiring to a boy whose mind craves something more. He spends every spare moment reading, borrowing books from anyone who will lend them, teaching himself about the world beyond Boston, beyond the colonies, beyond the narrow confines of a candlemaker's shop. Josiah worries about his son's restlessness. The boy talks of going to sea, of seeking adventure on the merchant ships that crowd Boston Harbor. One of Benjamin's older brothers has already gone to sea and never returned, presumably lost in a shipwreck, and Josiah is determined not to lose another son to the ocean. He casts about for a trade that might satisfy Benjamin's intelligence while keeping him safely on land. The answer comes in the form of Benjamin's older brother James, who has just returned from England where he learned the printing trade. In 1718, when Benjamin is 12 years old, Josiah apprentices him to James. The boy will learn to set type, operate a printing press, eventually master all aspects of the printing business. More importantly, he will be surrounded by words, by ideas, by the flow of information that a printing shop represents. It seems like the perfect solution, a practical trade for a bookish boy. But the relationship between the brothers will prove far more complicated than Josiah imagines, setting in motion events that will eventually drive Benjamin from Boston altogether, launching him on the path that will define his extraordinary life. Chapter 2: The Apprentice's Rebellion. The printing shop on Queen Street becomes young Benjamin's world. He rises before dawn to set type for his brother's newspaper, The New England Courant, the first truly independent newspaper in the American colonies. His fingers grow nimble at selecting letters from the typecase, arranging them into words and sentences, locking them into the press. The work is physically demanding, intellectually engaging, and it surrounds him with exactly what he craves: ideas, arguments, the clash of opinions about religion and politics and everything that matters in colonial life. James Franklin is ambitious, argumentative, and often in trouble with the authorities. The Courant publishes articles that question the Puritan establishment, that satirize Boston's leading ministers, that advocate for positions the authorities consider dangerously radical. More than once, James finds himself hauled before the colonial assembly to answer for what his newspaper has published. The printing shop becomes a gathering place for Boston's freethinkers, the Couranters, as they call themselves. Young men who fancy themselves wits and critics of the established order. Benjamin listens to these conversations, soaks up the arguments, learns the art of satire and persuasion. But his brother will not let him write for the newspaper. Benjamin is just an apprentice, a boy, his opinions worth nothing in James's eyes. The rejection stings, particularly because Benjamin can see that some of what the Couranters publish is no better than what he could write himself. So he hatches a plan. At 16 years old, Benjamin begins writing letters and slipping them under the door of the print shop at night, signing them with the pseudonym Silence Doe Good. The character he creates is a middle-aged widow, clever and opinionated, who offers commentary on Boston life with a sharp wit and a willingness to puncture the pretensions of the powerful. The letters are funny, insightful, provocative, exactly the kind of content the Courant thrives on. James loves them. He publishes them eagerly, praises the mysterious widow Dogood to anyone who will listen, speculates about who this talented writer might be. Some readers even write marriage proposals to the fictional widow. For Benjamin, it is a delicious secret, proof that his writing is good enough, that his ideas matter, that he is not just an apprentice, but a writer in his own right. The Silence Dogood letters run for 6 months, 14 in total, before Benjamin reveals himself as the author. The revelation does not go as he hoped. James is not proud or impressed. Instead, he is jealous and angry, feeling foolish for having praised his own apprentice without knowing it. The relationship between the brothers, never warm, turns cold and sometimes violent. James begins to beat Benjamin, using the authority of a master over his apprentice to settle scores that have nothing to do with the printing trade. Benjamin endures this for a time, but his resentment grows. The legal apprenticeship binds him to James until he turns 21, 5 more years of servitude to a brother who treats him with contempt. But then an opportunity arises. When James is briefly jailed for offending the authorities, he cannot legally continue publishing the Courant. To keep the newspaper running, he nominally transfers it to Benjamin, canceling the official apprenticeship papers while making Benjamin sign a secret contract to continue working for him. It is a mistake that gives Benjamin leverage. In the fall of 1723, at 17 years old, he makes his move. He tells James he is leaving, and when James tries to enforce the secret contract, Benjamin knows his brother cannot do so without revealing the deception to the authorities. James tries to blacklist Benjamin, contacting other printers in Boston to ensure none will hire the runaway apprentice. And so Benjamin Franklin, with almost no money, no prospects, and no plan beyond escaping his brother's control, does something that requires either courage or recklessness or both. He boards a ship and leaves Boston, the only home he has ever known, heading first to New York, and then, finding no work there, continuing on to Philadelphia. He arrives in October 1723, exhausted, hungry, with exactly $1 and a copper shilling in his pocket. He will never live in Boston again. The boy who ran away at 17 will become Philadelphia's most famous citizen, but he will never forget the lessons learned in his brother's print shop, about the power of words, about the importance of independence, about the need to forge one's own path rather than accept the limitations others try to impose. Chapter 3. Making a Name in Philadelphia. The young man who walks up from the Philadelphia wharf on that October morning in 1723 makes for an odd sight. His pockets are stuffed with extra shirts and stockings, making his coat bulge absurdly. He is tired, disheveled, hungry enough that he spends his Dutch dollar on 3 large puffy rolls at a bakery, eating one while walking the streets and carrying the other 2 under his arms. Later, he will describe this arrival with self-deprecating humor in his autobiography, knowing how ridiculous he must have appeared. As he walks past the Reed family's house on Market Street, a young woman named Deborah Reed sees him from the doorway and laughs at the strange sight he makes. Neither of them knows that she will become his wife, that this moment of amused mockery is the first scene in a love story that will last, through many complications, for more than 4 decades. Philadelphia in 1723 is smaller than Boston, about 7,000 inhabitants compared to Boston's 12,000, but it is growing faster, more dynamic, more open to newcomers. Founded by William Penn only 40 years earlier as a haven for Quakers and other religious dissenters, it has attracted a diverse population of English, Scots, Germans, and others seeking opportunity in the New World. Where Boston is dominated by Puritan conformity, Philadelphia embraces a certain practical tolerance, not because its citizens are necessarily more enlightened, but because diversity is good for business. Franklin finds work quickly at Samuel Keimer's print shop, demonstrating skills honed in his brother's shop in Boston. Keimer is an odd character, eccentric and not particularly talented as a printer, but he recognizes Franklin's abilities and puts him to work. Within weeks, Franklin is essentially running the shop, while Keimer takes credit for the results. But Philadelphia offers more than just work. It offers a chance to remake himself, to become the person he wants to be rather than the person his circumstances of birth dictated. He begins a program of rigorous self-improvement, rising early to read and study before work, practicing writing by rewriting essays from British publications in his own words, teaching himself mathematics, which had eluded him in school. He joins a debating club, sharpening his skills at argumentation and persuasion. The turning point comes when he meets Pennsylvania's governor, Sir William Keith, a charming and seemingly generous man who takes an interest in the talented young printer. Keith suggests that Franklin should set up his own printing business, offers to provide letters of credit and support, even proposes sending Franklin to London to purchase equipment and establish connections with suppliers. For an 18-year-old runaway apprentice, it seems like an extraordinary stroke of fortune. In 1724, Franklin sails for London carrying Keith's letters of introduction and credit. The voyage takes weeks, and when he arrives in England and tries to use the letters, he makes a devastating discovery. Governor Keith has given him nothing, no credit, no letters of introduction, nothing but empty promises from a man who apparently made grand gestures without any intention of following through. Franklin is stranded in London, thousands of miles from home, with no resources and no way back. But if this would break many young men, Franklin turns it into an opportunity. He finds work at a printing house, works hard, saves money, continues his program of self-improvement. London in the 1720s is one of the great cities of the world, vibrant with ideas and culture, and Franklin absorbs it all. He visits coffee houses where intellectuals debate philosophy and science. He reads voraciously. He even publishes a pamphlet on religious philosophy that, while later embarrassing him, demonstrates his willingness to engage with big ideas. After 18 months in London, Franklin earns enough money to book passage back to Philadelphia. He arrives in October 1726, 20 years old, considerably more experienced and worldly wise than the confused teenager who had left. He returns to work for Keimer, but now with a clear plan. He will save money, build his reputation, and establish his own printing business. And this time, he will rely on no one's promises but his own efforts. Within 2 years, at age 22, Benjamin Franklin opens his own print shop in Philadelphia. The boy from Boston has become a Philadelphia businessman, and he is just getting started. Chapter 4: Building a Reputation. The printing business Franklin establishes in 1728, in partnership with a man named Hugh Meredith, succeeds through a combination of hard work, quality craftsmanship, and shrewd self-promotion. Franklin understands something that many of his competitors do not, that in business, perception matters almost as much as reality. He makes sure people see him working, wheeling barrows of paper through the streets himself, staying up late with his lamps burning so passers-by will know he is industrious. He delivers work on time, keeps his promises, slowly builds a reputation as someone reliable in a city where many printers are erratic. The partnership with Meredith works well at first. Meredith's father provided much of the capital to start the business, but Meredith himself proves to be more interested in drinking than in printing. Franklin carries the workload, setting type, running the press, dealing with customers, keeping the books. Within 2 years, it becomes clear that Meredith is not suited to the business. Franklin arranges to buy out his partner's share, borrowing money from friends to do so, taking on debt, but gaining full control of the enterprise. Now the business is entirely his, and Franklin runs it with characteristic energy and attention to detail. He takes on apprentices, teaching them the trade as he was taught, though treating them with more kindness than his brother James showed him. He cultivates relationships with merchants and government officials who need printing done, always delivering quality work on time, building trust through reliability. Philadelphia in the late 1720s is growing rapidly, and a good printer can find plenty of work if he has the skill and the reputation. But Franklin is not content merely to print job work for other people. In 1729, at age 23, he begins publishing his own newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. It is not the first newspaper in Philadelphia, but under Franklin's direction it becomes the best, lively and well-written, willing to cover controversial topics, filled with wit and practical information. Franklin himself writes much of the content, often under pseudonyms, demonstrating the writing skills he first developed as Silence Dogood back in Boston. The newspaper makes him visible, gives him influence, establishes him as a shaper of public opinion rather than just a tradesman. But his greatest publishing success comes in 1732, when he begins issuing Poor Richard's Almanac. Almanacs are ubiquitous in colonial America, providing calendars, weather predictions, astronomical information, advice, and entertainment, all bound together in an inexpensive package that nearly every household owns. Franklin's Almanac, published under the pseudonym Richard Saunders, stands out for its wit and wisdom. Poor Richard becomes famous for aphorisms that Franklin either invents or borrows and polishes, sayings that will echo through American culture for centuries. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. God helps those who help themselves. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. The mix of practical advice, humor, and homespun philosophy strikes a chord. The almanac becomes a bestseller, eventually selling 10,000 copies a year, making Franklin not just successful, but wealthy. In September 1730, Franklin marries Deborah Reed, the same young woman who laughed at his bedraggled appearance when he first arrived in Philadelphia. Their relationship is unconventional by the standards of the time. It is a common law marriage rather than a formal ceremony, necessary because Deborah's first husband has abandoned her but cannot be proven dead, making her technically still married under Pennsylvania law. Franklin also brings to the marriage a young son, William, born to a woman Franklin never publicly identifies, acknowledging his child but drawing a veil over the circumstances of his birth. Deborah proves a capable partner in business as well as in life, managing the print shop's bookstore, dealing with customers, keeping the accounts when Franklin is away. They will have 2 children together, Francis, who will die heartbreakingly young of smallpox, and Sarah, who will survive to adulthood. The marriage is solid, if not romantic, based on mutual respect and partnership more than passion. By his mid-30s, Franklin has achieved a level of success that would satisfy most men. His printing business thrives. His newspaper and almanac are widely read. He has become prosperous enough to own property, to employ journeymen and apprentices, to think about the future with confidence rather than anxiety. But Franklin is not most men, and mere business success is not enough to satisfy his restless, curious mind. In 1731, he proposes the creation of a lending library, the first of its kind in America, where members can pool their resources to purchase books and make them available to all. The Library Company of Philadelphia becomes a model that other cities will copy, democratizing access to knowledge in a society where books are expensive and private libraries are the province of the wealthy. In 1736, he organizes Philadelphia's first volunteer fire company, recognizing that fire is a constant threat in a city of wooden buildings, and that organized cooperation is the best defense against it. Later, he will help establish a hospital, an academy that will become the University of Pennsylvania, an insurance company, a learned society for discussing science and philosophy. Franklin has a talent for seeing what his community needs and organizing people to provide it, for turning ideas into institutions that outlast their founders. But even as he builds these civic institutions, even as he cements his position as one of Philadelphia's leading citizens, his mind is turning toward questions that have nothing to do with printing or business or civic improvement. He is becoming fascinated by the mysteries of the natural world, by questions of how things work, by the new science of electricity that is capturing the attention of learned men throughout Europe and America. Chapter 5. The Scientist Emerges. In the 1740s, electricity is a fashionable curiosity among educated people in Europe and the colonies. Demonstrations of electrical phenomena draw crowds who gasp and laugh as experimenters create sparks, make objects attract and repel each other, even administer mild shocks for entertainment. It is seen as an amusing parlor trick, a mysterious force that can be demonstrated but not really understood or controlled. Franklin first encounters electrical experiments in 1744 when a traveling lecturer named Adam Spencer visits Boston. Franklin, back visiting his family, watches the demonstration with the interest of someone who has always been curious about how the world works. But it is not until a few years later, when a fellow member of his philosophical society receives some electrical apparatus from England, that Franklin begins seriously investigating the subject himself. What sets Franklin apart from most electrical experimenters of his time is his systematic approach. Where others are content to demonstrate phenomena, Franklin wants to understand them, to develop a theory that explains what is happening. He observes that electrical charge can be transferred from one object to another, that it can be stored and released. He notices that some materials conduct electricity while others insulate against it. He develops the idea that electricity is not two different fluids, as prevailing theory suggests, but a single fluid that can be present in excess or deficit, what he calls positive and negative charge. These are not just abstract theories. Franklin uses them to make predictions that he then tests experimentally. He proposes that lightning is electrical in nature, offering a series of similarities between lightning and the electrical sparks created in laboratory demonstrations. Both produce light, both create a crackling sound, both are attracted to metal, both can kill. The similarities are too striking to be coincidental, Franklin argues. Lightning and electricity must be the same thing, but how to prove it? In Europe, experimenters begin building tall metal rods to test Franklin's theory, trying to draw electricity from storm clouds. In May 1752, a French scientist named Thomas-François Dalibard successfully demonstrates that Franklin's theory is correct, using a tall iron rod to collect electrical charge from a storm cloud. The news will take months to reach America, traveling slowly by ship across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Franklin has been waiting for Christ Church to finish its tall steeple, planning to use it as a platform for his own electrical rod experiment. But the construction drags on, and Franklin grows impatient. Then, sometime in June 1752, he has an idea. Why wait for the church steeple? A kite can carry a wire high into the sky, high enough to test whether storm clouds are electrically charged. On a June day in 1752, Franklin and his son William conduct the now legendary kite experiment. The setup is carefully designed to be somewhat safe. A silk ribbon keeps the string dry where Franklin holds it, insulating him from the dangerous levels of electricity that would kill him if lightning actually struck the kite. A metal key attached to the hemp string allows him to test for electrical charge. As the storm approaches and rain wets the hemp string, making it conductive, Franklin sees the loose fibers of the string stand on end, charged with electricity from the clouds. He touches his hand to the key and feels the spark. The experiment proves what Franklin suspected, that lightning is indeed electrical in nature, that the heavens themselves are governed by natural laws that can be understood through reason and experiment. But Franklin goes further. If lightning is electrical, and if electricity is attracted to metal points, then a pointed metal rod attached to the top of a building should attract lightning strikes and conduct them harmlessly into the ground, protecting the building from fire. The lightning rod is Franklin's most practical invention, and it makes him famous throughout Europe and America. Within a few years, lightning rods are being installed on buildings from Boston to Paris, protecting property and saving lives. It is a perfect example of Franklin's approach to science, not knowledge for its own sake alone, but knowledge that serves practical human needs. The scientific work brings Franklin recognition from the world's leading learned societies. The Royal Society of London awards him its Copley Medal, the highest scientific honor of the age. Universities grant him honorary degrees. The man who left school at 10 years old is now recognized as one of the foremost natural philosophers in the world, discussed in the same conversations as Isaac Newton and other giants of science. But even as his scientific reputation grows, Franklin is being drawn into another realm entirely, the complex and dangerous world of colonial politics, where the skills of persuasion and negotiation will matter more than experimental demonstrations, where the stakes are not scientific recognition, but the future of the American colonies and their relationship with Great Britain. Chapter 6: The Politician and Postmaster. In the 1740s and 1750s, Franklin's success in business allows him to step back from the day-to-day management of his printing operations. He takes on partners in other cities, creating a network of printing shops that brings him steady income without requiring his constant attention. At age 42, he is wealthy enough to retire from active business, though he never stops working. He simply shifts his energy from printing to public service and scientific inquiry. In 1751, Franklin is elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly, beginning a political career that will span decades. He proves to be a skilled legislator, pragmatic rather than ideological, focused on solving problems rather than scoring points. He understands that politics is the art of the possible, that perfect should not be the enemy of good, that compromise is not weakness but wisdom. One of his first major political initiatives is the Albany Plan of Union, proposed in 1754 at Aichi. Congress called to coordinate colonial defense against the French and their Native American allies. Franklin's plan calls for a union of the colonies under a grand council that would handle matters of common concern like defense, western expansion, and relations with Native Americans. Each colony would retain its own government for local matters, but they would cooperate on issues affecting them all. It is a visionary proposal, sketching out a federal system that anticipates the structure the United States will eventually adopt. But in 1754, it is too far ahead of its time. The colonial assemblies reject it, unwilling to give up any of their individual authority. The British government also rejects it, seeing it as a potential threat to royal control. Franklin is disappointed, but not surprised. He has learned that good ideas often need time to ripen before people are ready to accept them. In 1753, Franklin is appointed Deputy Postmaster General for the American colonies, a position that gives him oversight of the colonial postal system. It is not a ceremonial role. The postal service is inefficient, slow, money-losing. Franklin throws himself into improving it, establishing faster routes, making deliveries more reliable, turning a deficit into a profit. The work requires extensive travel through the colonies, and Franklin uses these trips to observe, to learn about different regions and their concerns, to build a network of contacts that will serve him well in years to come. But the political issue that will define this period of Franklin's life is the relationship between Pennsylvania and its proprietors, the Penn family, who own the colony as a kind of feudal estate. The Penns live in England, collecting rents and revenues from Pennsylvania, but paying no taxes on their vast land holdings. This strikes Franklin and many other Pennsylvanians as fundamentally unfair, particularly when the colony needs to raise money for defense against French and Native American attacks. The struggle with the Penns brings Franklin to England in 1757 as Pennsylvania's agent, tasked with persuading the British government to force the Penns to pay their fair share of taxes. He expects to be in London for a few months, perhaps a year at most. Instead, he will remain in England with one brief return to Philadelphia for nearly 18 years, becoming America's unofficial ambassador to Britain, the colonists' most effective advocate in the halls of power. London in 1757 is the greatest city in the world, the capital of a global empire, a place of incredible wealth and equally incredible poverty, of refined culture and brutal inequality. Franklin is 51 years old when he arrives, already famous for his scientific work, respected as a colonial leader. He is received by the Royal Society, dines with philosophers and politicians, moves in circles that would have been unimaginable to the runaway apprentice from Boston. But he is in England for a purpose, and he pursues it with characteristic persistence. The battle with the pens drags on for years, complicated by English politics and the pen's connections at court. Franklin eventually achieves a partial victory. The pens agree to allow taxation of their lands, though at a lower rate than other property. It is not everything Franklin wanted, but it is progress. More importantly, the years in England transform Franklin's understanding of the colonial relationship with Britain. He arrives thinking of himself as a loyal British subject seeking fair treatment for fellow subjects who happen to live across the Atlantic. He will leave convinced that the colonies and Britain are on fundamentally different paths, that the relationship cannot continue in its present form, that something must change, though he does not yet know what that change will be. Chapter 7. The Path to Revolution. Franklin returns briefly to Philadelphia in 1762, but by 1764 he is back in England, this time as an agent not just for Pennsylvania, but eventually for Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts as well. He is the colonists' man in London, the person British officials consult when they want to understand American sentiment, the person colonists write to when they need their views represented to the British government. The relationship between Britain and the American colonies is entering a period of increasing strain. The French and Indian War has ended with British victory, giving Britain control of North America east of the Mississippi. But the war has been expensive, leaving Britain with enormous debts. Parliament decides that the colonies should pay a larger share of the costs of their own defense and administration. In 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act, requiring that legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, and many other items in the colonies carry a tax stamp. The revenue is meant to help pay for British troops stationed in America. To Parliament, it seems reasonable. To the colonists, it is an outrageous violation of their rights as Englishmen to be taxed without representation in the legislature imposing the tax. The colonies erupt in protest. Mobs burn stamp collectors in effigy and sometimes attack them in person. Merchants organize boycotts of British goods. Colonial assemblies pass resolutions declaring the Stamp Act unconstitutional. Franklin, in London, is caught off guard by the intensity of the reaction. He has not opposed the Stamp Act strongly enough for the taste of many colonists, and when it is revealed that he secured the position of stamp collector in Philadelphia for a friend, some even accuse him of supporting the hated tax. Franklin recognizes his mistake and works to correct it. In February 1766, he appears before the House of Commons to testify about American opposition to the Stamp Act. His performance is masterful. He patiently explains why Americans object to the tax, not because they oppose contributing to imperial defense, but because they insist on being taxed only by their own elected representatives. He warns that forcing the Stamp Act on unwilling colonies will damage the relationship between Britain and America, will turn loyal subjects into resentful ones, His testimony helps persuade Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, though they simultaneously pass the Declaratory Act, asserting their right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The repeal is greeted with joy in America, and Franklin's reputation recovers. But the underlying issue remains unresolved. Does Parliament have the authority to tax the colonies? Can the colonies be considered full parts of the British political system if they have no representation in Parliament? Over the next few years, Parliament continues trying to raise revenue from the colonies through various taxes. Each attempt meets resistance. Each round of resistance is met with threats. The spiral of resentment and recrimination tightens. Franklin, watching from London, begins to despair of finding a peaceful resolution. His personal life during these years is complicated. Deborah remains in Philadelphia, unwilling to make the ocean voyage to join him in London. They write letters, but the distance creates a gulf. Franklin lives in London in the household of his landlady Margaret Stevenson, developing a close friendship with her daughter Mary that is perhaps the deepest emotional connection of his later life, a relationship of minds and spirits, if not of romance. In 1774, Franklin's position in London becomes untenable. Private letters he obtained and sent to Massachusetts, written by the royal governor, suggesting that liberties in the colony should be restricted, are published in Boston, creating a scandal. The British government, looking for someone to blame, summons Franklin to appear before the Privy Council. There, the Solicitor General subjects him to an hour of public humiliation, accusing him of theft, of betraying confidences, of fomenting rebellion. Franklin stands silent through the abuse, maintaining his dignity even as his reputation in Britain is shredded. Shortly after, he is dismissed from his position as Deputy Postmaster General, his main source of official income. It is meant as punishment, but it frees Franklin from any remaining obligation to the British government. In March 1775, he sails for Philadelphia, arriving to find that war has already begun. While he was at sea, British troops clashed with colonial militia at Lexington and Concord. The conflict that Franklin tried for years to prevent is now underway. The long years of trying to bridge the gap between Britain and America are over. At 69 years old, Benjamin Franklin must decide where his loyalties lie. It is not a difficult choice. He is an American, and America needs him. Chapter 8: Founding a Nation. Franklin arrives in Philadelphia on May 5, 1775, just weeks after the first shots of the Revolutionary War. The city is in turmoil, full of rumors and refugees, of militia drilling in the streets and politicians arguing about what to do next. The Second Continental Congress is about to convene, and Franklin is quickly elected as Pennsylvania's delegate. At 69, he is by far the oldest delegate, old enough to be the grandfather of many of the others. But he is also the most famous, known throughout the colonies and in Europe, respected for his scientific achievements and his years of service representing American interests in Britain. His presence lends the Congress credibility and gravitas. The colonies are not yet united in seeking independence. Many hope for reconciliation with Britain, for a return to the status quo before Parliament began imposing taxes and restrictions. But Franklin, after his years in London, knows that reconciliation, acceptable terms, is impossible. The British government sees the colonists as subordinates who must submit to parliamentary authority. The colonists see themselves as free people with rights that no government can legitimately violate. The gap is unbridgeable. Still, the Congress moves cautiously. They send petitions to the king, asking for redress of grievances. They raise an army, but claim they are only defending themselves, not seeking separation. Franklin participates in these efforts, but pushes quietly for bolder action. He is appointed to the committee tasked with managing the newly created post office, to committees on defense and on foreign affairs. His experience and his contacts make him invaluable. In June 1776, the Congress appoints a committee to draft a declaration explaining why the colonies are seeking independence. Franklin is named to the committee along with John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson, at 33, less than half Franklin's age, is chosen to write the first draft. The young Virginian labors over the document, crafting phrases that will echo through history. Franklin's contribution to the Declaration of Independence is modest but significant. He suggests a few changes to Jefferson's draft, most famously changing "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable" to "We hold these truths to be self-evident," a shift from religious language to the language of reason that makes the Declaration's claims rest on natural law rather than divine revelation. It is a small change in wording, a profound change in philosophical foundation. On July 4, 1776, the Congress adopts the Declaration. Franklin, along with the other delegates, knows what this means. They are committing treason against the crown. If the revolution fails, they will hang. As they prepare to sign, John Hancock reportedly says, "We must all hang together." Franklin replies, "Yes, we must indeed all hang together, or most. Assuredly, we shall all hang separately." Even in this grave moment, Franklin cannot resist a witticism. But declaring independence is easier than achieving it. The British Army is the most powerful military force in the world. The Continental Army is a collection of militia and volunteers, often poorly equipped and trained. General Washington is doing his best, but the early years of the war bring more defeats than victories. The colonies need help. Specifically, they need help from France, Britain's traditional enemy, and the only power capable of challenging British naval supremacy. In September 1776, Congress sends Franklin to France as one of 3 American commissioners tasked with securing French support. It is a desperate gamble. Franklin is 70 years old, suffering from gout and kidney stones, facing a dangerous ocean voyage followed by months or years of diplomatic negotiations in a foreign capital. But the mission is too important to refuse, and Franklin is the one American most likely to succeed in it. He arrives in France in December 1776, just as Washington's army is suffering devastating defeats in New York. The American cause looks hopeless. Franklin must somehow convince the French to bet on a losing side, to risk war with Britain for the sake of rebellious colonies that may not survive another year. It seems impossible. But Franklin is about to demonstrate that his talents as a diplomat match his genius as a scientist and his success as a businessman. Over the next 9 years, he will achieve diplomatic triumphs that help win American independence and establish the new nation's place in the world. Chapter 9: The Sage of Paris. Franklin's arrival in France creates a sensation. He is already famous there for his electrical experiments, celebrated as the man who tamed lightning. French scientists have read his papers. European aristocrats have heard tales of his experiments, and intellectuals throughout the continent know his name. But he is more than a scientist. He is a symbol, an embodiment of American simplicity and natural wisdom, standing in contrast to European corruption and artifice. The French intellectuals, enthralled with ideas about the noble savage and the purity of nature, ideas popularized by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and other philosophers, see in Franklin exactly what they want to see: a wise man from the New World, where humanity lives closer to nature, uncorrupted by the artificial refinements of European civilization. And Franklin, shrewd as always, plays the part perfectly. He arrives in France wearing a fur cap instead of the fashionable wig worn by gentlemen, the kind of cap a frontiersman might wear in the American wilderness. He dresses in plain brown clothes, his Quaker suit, projecting an image of rustic simplicity, even though he is not actually a Quaker. He presents himself as a natural philosopher from the American wilderness, unschooled in European court etiquette, guided by common sense and natural virtue rather than sophisticated learning. He lets his spectacles and his simple dress do the talking, signaling that here is a man who values substance over style, wisdom over fashion. It is, of course, a performance. Franklin has spent years in London, is perfectly comfortable in sophisticated company, knows exactly how to navigate the intricacies of high society. He can match wits with the best minds in Europe, can hold his own in salon conversations about philosophy and literature and science. But he understands that in this moment, being seen as a simple American sage serves his purposes better than displaying his actual sophistication. The French eat it up. His image appears on medallions, snuff boxes, rings, watches, even chamber pots. Ladies compete for his attention, inviting him to their salons, seeking his conversation and his company. Salons vie for the honor of hosting him, knowing that an appearance by Franklin will make their gathering the talk of Paris. But beneath the celebrity, Franklin is working tirelessly at the real task: convincing the French government to support the American Revolution. It is delicate work. France would love to see Britain humiliated, would benefit strategically from American independence weakening British power. But France is also cautious, unwilling to commit to open war with Britain unless the Americans demonstrate they can actually win. Franklin's challenge is compounded by his fellow commissioners. Arthur Lee is suspicious and quarrelsome, convinced that Franklin is too friendly with the French, too willing to compromise. Silas Deane is eventually recalled amid accusations of financial impropriety. Franklin must conduct diplomacy while managing these internal conflicts, must project unity while his colleagues undermine each other. The breakthrough comes in December 1777, when news reaches Paris of General Gates's victory over British General Burgoyne at Saratoga. It is the first major American victory, proof that the Continental Army can defeat British regulars in pitched battle. Franklin seizes the moment. Within weeks, he negotiates 2 treaties with France: a treaty of amity and commerce establishing trade relations, and a treaty of alliance making France and America military allies against Britain. The alliance transforms the war. French money, weapons, and eventually troops and naval power flow to America. The revolution, which seemed on the verge of collapse, now has the backing of one of Europe's great powers. It is perhaps the most important diplomatic achievement in American history, and it is largely Franklin's doing. For the next 5 years, Franklin serves as America's minister to France, managing the alliance, securing loans to keep the American war effort funded, handling the 1,000 details of diplomacy. He is now in his 70s, often in pain from gout and kidney stones, but he continues working with remarkable energy. He also enjoys himself. Paris in the 1780s is at the height of the Enlightenment, a city of salons and cafes where philosophers debate the future of humanity, where scientists demonstrate new discoveries, where artists and writers create works that will define an age. Franklin is at the center of it all, friend to Voltaire and Turgot, correspondent with scientists across Europe, celebrated guest at the most fashionable gatherings. There are rumors of romantic entanglements, of flirtations with younger women, some married to other men. Franklin is charming, witty, famous, and appears to enjoy female company. How far these relationships go is unclear, probably deliberately so, on Franklin's part. He enjoys the game of courtship, the witty correspondence, the ambiguous intimacy. Whether it goes beyond that is a secret he keeps. In 1781, the war turns decisively in America's favor. General Washington, with crucial help from French troops and the French Navy, traps British General Cornwallis at Yorktown and forces his surrender. It is effectively the end of the fighting, though formal peace negotiations will take nearly 2 more years. Franklin leads the American delegation negotiating with the British. It is complex work, requiring him to balance American interests, French expectations as America's ally, and British willingness to make concessions. The final treaty, signed in September 1783, is remarkably favorable to America, granting independence, establishing generous borders, securing fishing rights, and requiring British withdrawal from American territory. The Treaty of Paris is Franklin's final great diplomatic achievement. At 77 years old, he has helped win a war, secured crucial foreign support, and negotiated a peace that gives the new nation room to grow and prosper. He has earned his rest. But America is not yet ready to let him go. Chapter 10. The Constitutional Convention. Franklin finally returns to Philadelphia in September 1785, after 9 years in France. He is 79 years old, suffering from painful kidney stones that make travel agonizing, relieved to be home at last. He settles into his house on Market Street, surrounded by his daughter Sarah and her family, hoping perhaps for a quiet retirement filled with reading and correspondence with old friends. But Philadelphia has other plans for him. Within weeks of his return, he is elected president of Pennsylvania's Executive Council, essentially the governor of the state. It is largely a ceremonial role, appropriate for an elder statesman, but it keeps Franklin involved in public affairs. He serves for 3 years, using his prestige to calm political disputes, to lend legitimacy to the new state government. The young United States is struggling. The Articles of Confederation, the Constitution adopted during the Revolutionary War, creates a weak central government with limited power to coordinate the states or address national problems. The states are quarreling with each other over borders and trade. The national government cannot pay its debts, cannot enforce treaties, cannot provide for the common defense. Many fear the Confederation will dissolve into separate nations, or worse, fall back under European control. In May 1787, delegates from the states gather in Philadelphia for a convention ostensibly called to revise the Articles of Confederation. Franklin, though now 81 and in frail health, is elected as one of Pennsylvania's delegates. He is the oldest person at the convention by more than a decade, older than some delegates' fathers. The convention quickly decides that revising the articles is not enough. They need to create an entirely new framework of government. Through the hot Philadelphia summer, they debate the structure of this new government. Should there be a single executive or a committee? How? Should states be represented in the legislature? What powers should the national government have? Should slavery be protected or restricted? Franklin does not speak often. His voice is weak, and he has trouble standing for long periods. When he has something important to say, he writes it out and has another delegate read it to the convention. But his presence matters enormously. He is the convention's conscience, reminding the younger delegates of the principles they are fighting for, urging them to compromise when debates become bitter. One of his most important interventions comes when the convention is deadlocked over representation. Small states want equal representation for each state. Large states want representation based on population. The dispute threatens to break up the convention. Franklin proposes a compromise, one house of the legislature with equal representation for each state, another with representation based on population. It is not his original idea, but his support helps it gain acceptance. The Great Compromise saves the convention and shapes the structure of Congress to this day. As the convention nears its end, some delegates are unhappy with the final document. It is full of compromises, satisfies no one completely, leaves many questions unresolved. Franklin rises, or rather has his speech read for him, urging the delegates to sign despite their reservations. "I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve," he says, "but I am not sure I shall never approve them." He argues that the Constitution, imperfect as it is the best they can achieve, that the experiment is worth trying. His endorsement carries weight. If Franklin, with all his experience and wisdom, can support this document despite its flaws, others can do the same. On September 17th, 1787, 39 delegates sign the Constitution. Franklin is among them, making him the only person to sign all four of the founding documents of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution. As the delegates prepare to leave the convention, a woman reportedly asks Franklin what kind of government they have created. "A republic, madam," he replies, "if you can keep it." It is vintage Franklin, hopeful but realistic, understanding that creating a good government is just the beginning, that maintaining it will require constant effort and vigilance. Chapter 11. The Final Years. Franklin's last years are marked by pain and gradual decline, but also by continued intellectual activity and a deepening concern with the moral question that had troubled him throughout his life: slavery. In his youth, Franklin had owned enslaved people and published advertisements for slave sales in his newspaper. But over the decades, his views evolved. By the 1780s, he has become a convinced abolitionist, serving as president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. In February 1790, just months before his death, Franklin signs a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery. It is his last significant public act, a statement of principle from a man who no longer has to worry about political consequences. The petition is not successful. The young nation is not ready to confront its original sin, but Franklin has made his position clear. His physical decline accelerates. The kidney stones that have plagued him for years cause excruciating pain. He can barely walk, spends most of his time in bed or in a chair, his once vibrant body failing even as his mind remains sharp. He continues to receive visitors, to dictate letters, to follow events in Europe where revolution is now sweeping France, the country that had been his second home. In his final weeks, he works on his autobiography, the memoir he had started years earlier but never finished. It will remain incomplete at his death, ending before the Revolutionary War, but what exists is remarkable, a candid self-portrait that establishes a model for American autobiography, the story of a self-made man rising from humble origins through hard work and virtue. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin dies at his home on Market Street. He is 84 years old. His daughter Sarah is with him at the end, along with her children. Outside, the city he had done so much to shape goes about its business, not yet knowing that its most famous citizen has passed. The funeral, held 4 days later, is the largest Philadelphia has ever seen. 20,000 people attend, nearly the entire population of the city. Printers and intellectuals, politicians and ordinary citizens, people of all backgrounds come to pay their respects to the man who had been printer and scientist, businessman and statesman, diplomat and founder. The tributes pour in from around the world. In France, the National Assembly votes to wear mourning for 3 days, an unprecedented honor for a foreigner. The French revolutionary leader Mirabeau delivers a eulogy calling Franklin the sage whom 2 worlds claim as their own. In America, Congress votes to wear mourning for a month. But perhaps the most fitting tribute is simply this: that Franklin's inventions and institutions continue to serve, that the nation he helped found endures, that his autobiography continues to inspire readers with its message that anyone, regardless of birth or circumstance, can achieve great things through diligence and virtue and an insatiable curiosity about the world. Chapter 12: The Printer's Legacy. Of all Franklin's roles, he always thought of himself first as a printer. It was the trade he learned as a boy, the profession that made his fortune, the skill that underlay all his other achievements. Understanding Franklin the printer helps us understand everything else he became. Printing in Franklin's time was more than a craft. It was a form of power. Printers controlled what got published, what ideas circulated, what information reached the public. A printer could shape public opinion, could make reputations or destroy them, could advance causes or obstruct them. Franklin understood this from his earliest days in his brother's print shop in Boston. The Pennsylvania Gazette, which Franklin owned and largely wrote, was his laboratory for testing ideas, his platform for shaping Philadelphia's civic life. Through the Gazette, he promoted his schemes for civic improvement, the library, the fire company, the hospital, the academy. Through the Gazette, he subtly shaped opinion on political issues, always careful to present multiple viewpoints, even as he steered the conversation in directions he favored. Poor Richard's Almanac was something else again, a commercial success certainly, but also a vehicle for Franklin's philosophy of life. The aphorisms that filled its pages were not random wisdom. They were a coherent worldview, emphasizing industry, frugality, self-improvement, practical virtue. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise is not just advice about sleep. It is a statement about the relationship between personal discipline and success. A penny saved is a penny earned is not just about money. It is about valuing what you have, about recognizing that avoiding waste is as important as increasing income. These sayings became part of American culture, repeated so often that people forgot they came from Poor Richard, assumed they were ancient proverbs rather than the calculated creations of a Philadelphia printer. That is the measure of Franklin's success. He shaped the American mindset, created commonplaces that defined how Americans thought about work and success and virtue. But Franklin's printer's legacy extends beyond his own publications. He trained apprentices who went on to establish their own print shops throughout the colonies. He created partnerships with printers in other cities, building a network that shared resources and information. He understood that a free press, multiple independent voices competing and checking each other, was essential to liberty. As a printer, Franklin also understood the power of pseudonyms, of adopting different voices to make different arguments. Silence. Doe Good, Poor Richard, Polly Baker, the dozens of fictional characters he created over the years, each allowed him to explore different ideas, to take positions he might not take under his own name, to play with rhetoric and persuasion. It was training in empathy and argument, in seeing issues from multiple perspectives, skills that served him well in diplomacy and politics. The printing trade also taught Franklin the virtue of precision. A printer must get every letter right, every word in its proper place, every line correctly spaced. There is no room for approximation, no place for close enough. This attention to detail, learned at the type case, characterized everything Franklin did, from his scientific experiments to his diplomatic negotiations. And finally, the printing trade taught Franklin about the power of the written word to outlast the moment. A speech is heard once and forgotten. A conversation fades from memory. But printed words endure, are copied and spread, influence people the author will never meet. Franklin lived his life understanding that words matter, that how you express an idea is almost as important as the idea itself, that the right phrase at the right moment can change minds and move nations. Chapter 13: The Scientist's Mind. Franklin came to science relatively late, in his 40s, after he had already achieved success in business and established himself in Philadelphia's civic life. But when he turned his attention to natural philosophy, he brought to it all the qualities that had made him successful in other endeavors: systematic observation, careful reasoning, willingness to test ideas experimentally, and an insistence on practical application. His electrical experiments, conducted largely in the late 1740s and early 1750s, were not the work of someone playing with an amusing toy. Franklin approached electricity with the mind of an engineer as much as a scientist. He wanted to understand not just what electricity did, but how it worked, what rules governed its behavior, how it could be controlled and used. The theory of electrical charge that Franklin developed, the idea of a single electrical fluid that could be present in excess or deficit rather than two different fluids, was elegant and powerful. It explained observed phenomena, made predictions that could be tested, and provided a framework for understanding electrical effects. The terms Franklin introduced, positive and negative, plus and minus, conductor and insulator, are still used today. His theory was not perfect. We now know that electricity involves the movement of electrons, not a fluid, but it was close enough to the truth to be enormously useful. The lightning rod was the practical payoff, the demonstration that understanding nature allows us to protect ourselves from its dangers. But Franklin's scientific work extended beyond electricity. He studied ocean currents, creating the first map of the Gulf Stream based on interviews with ship captains and his own observations. He investigated meteorology, tracking storms and recognizing that northeastern storms actually move from southwest to northeast, contrary to the wind direction. He experimented with heat and cooling, invented a more efficient stove that bore his name, designed bifocal glasses to solve his own vision problems. In every case, Franklin's approach was pragmatic. He was not interested in abstract knowledge for its own sake. He wanted to understand nature so that he could work with it, solve problems, improve human life. This practical orientation sometimes frustrated more theoretically minded scientists, but it meant that Franklin's scientific work had immediate real-world impact. What made Franklin a great scientist was not just his intelligence, though he was certainly intelligent, but his curiosity, his willingness to question received wisdom, his habit of careful observation. He noticed things others overlooked, asked questions others did not think to ask, tested assumptions others accepted without thought, and he shared his discoveries freely. Unlike some natural philosophers who hoarded their findings or published them in obscure language, Franklin wrote clearly and corresponded widely, eager to share what he learned and to learn from others. His letters to Peter Collinson in London were read before the Royal Society and published, making his discoveries available to scientists throughout Europe. He refused to patent the lightning rod or his other practical inventions, believing that as he had benefited from the discoveries of others, others should benefit from his discoveries without having to pay him. This open, collaborative approach to science was ahead of its time. Franklin understood that scientific progress is a collective enterprise, that each investigator builds on the work of those who came before, that hoarding knowledge slows the advancement of understanding. It was a philosophy that served science well, and it reflected Franklin's deeper conviction that knowledge should serve the common good, not just the interests of those who possess it. Chapter 14: The Diplomat's Art. Franklin's diplomatic achievements in France from 1776 to 1785 are arguably his most important contribution to American independence. Without French support, the revolution almost certainly would have failed. And while France had its own reasons for supporting the Americans, reasons having to do with weakening Britain rather than love of liberty, it was Franklin who turned French sympathy into material support, who kept the alliance functioning through difficult years, who negotiated the peace treaty that secured American independence. What made Franklin an effective diplomat? First, his ability to read people and situations, to understand what motivated others, what they needed, what they feared. In Paris, he recognized that the French intellectual elite wanted to see him as a symbol of American natural virtue, so he gave them that symbol, playing the rustic philosopher even as he maneuvered through the intricacies of European court politics. Second, his patience. Diplomacy moves slowly, requires waiting for the right moment, building relationships over months and years, accepting small victories when larger ones are not available. Franklin, in his 70s when he arrived in France, had no need to prove himself, no career to build. He could afford to wait, to let events develop, to trust that persistence would eventually yield results. Third, his charm. Franklin was genuinely liked by the French, not just respected or admired, but liked. He was witty, self-deprecating, willing to listen, interested in others. These are not small things in diplomacy. When negotiations become difficult, when interests conflict, when tensions rise, personal relationships can make the difference between breakdown and breakthrough. The French negotiators wanted to help Franklin, wanted him to succeed, and that mattered. Fourth, his pragmatism. Franklin was willing to compromise, to accept partial victories, to recognize that perfect is the enemy of good. When negotiating the peace treaty with Britain, he was not afraid to negotiate separately from France, even though this violated the letter of the Franco-American alliance, because he saw that America could get better terms by dealing directly with London. It was a risk. It could have alienated France, but Franklin correctly judged that France would accept the fait accompli rather than let the peace negotiations collapse. Finally, his credibility. Franklin's scientific reputation gave him standing independent of his official position. When he spoke, people listened, not just because he represented America, but because he was Benjamin Franklin, the man who had tamed lightning. That extra dimension of respect and authority made his diplomacy more effective. But Franklin's diplomatic success came at a personal cost. His son William, who had helped him with the kite experiment, who had served as royal governor of New Jersey, remained loyal to Britain when the Revolution began. The break between father and son was bitter and permanent. William ended up in England, an exile from the nation his father helped create. The two never fully reconciled, a reminder that the Revolution tore apart families as well as political ties, that personal loyalty and political principle sometimes conflict in ways that allow no easy resolution. Chapter 15: The Moral Philosopher. Throughout his life, Franklin thought deeply about questions of right and wrong, about how to live a good life, about the relationship between individual virtue and social welfare. He was not a philosopher in the academic sense. He wrote no systematic treatise on ethics, founded no school of moral philosophy. But he thought about these questions constantly, and his conclusion shaped both his personal conduct and his public advocacy. As a young man, Franklin created a system for cultivating virtue, identifying 13 virtues he wanted to practice: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. He kept a notebook in which he tracked his daily success at practicing each virtue, marking down his failures, trying to improve week by week. It is a very Franklin approach to moral improvement, systematic, measurable, focused on practice rather than contemplation. And Franklin was honest about his limited success. He never mastered all 13 virtues, and his later addition of humility to the list, with the wry comment that he was proud of how humble he had become, shows his awareness of the gap between aspiration and achievement. But the effort itself mattered. Franklin believed that virtue, like any other skill, improves with practice. You become temperate by practicing temperance, honest by practicing honesty. Virtue is not something you possess once and for all. It is something you work at every day, often failing but trying again. This pragmatic approach to ethics extended to his religious views. Franklin was raised in a strict Puritan household, but early on questioned many orthodox Christian doctrines. He could not accept the idea of eternal damnation for finite sins, could not believe that a benevolent God would create humans destined for hell, could not reconcile divine providence with human free will. But he also recognized that religion, whatever its truth claims, served important social functions. It encouraged moral behavior, provided comfort in difficult times, built community. So Franklin supported churches, even as he questioned their theologies, paid his subscription to Presbyterian congregations, even though he rarely attended services, believed that encouraging religious faith among the general population was good for society, even if he himself was skeptical. His own religious views, worked out over a lifetime, were essentially deist. He believed in a creator God who established natural laws but did not intervene in daily affairs. He believed that the best way to serve God was to do good to other people, that moral living mattered more than correct belief. Near the end of his life, asked about his religious creed, he wrote that he believed in God, in the immortality of the soul, and that the most acceptable service to God was doing good to other people. It is a characteristically Franklin formulation, practical, focused on action rather than belief, insistent that what matters is how you treat others, not what doctrines you profess. And it led him, especially in his later years, to confront the great moral question that his generation largely failed to answer adequately: slavery. More than 2 centuries after his death, Benjamin Franklin remains one of the most recognizable Americans, his face on the $100 bill, his name attached to streets and schools and institutions across the country. But who is the Franklin we remember, and what does his life still teach us? In part, we remember Franklin the success story, the self-made man who rose from poverty to wealth and fame through hard work and talent. This is the Franklin of the autobiography, the printer's apprentice who becomes a respected businessman, the poor boy who dines with kings. It is a powerful story, quintessentially American, the promise that anyone can succeed regardless of birth or circumstance. But this story, true as far as it goes, can be misleading. Franklin succeeded partly through hard work and ability, yes, but also through luck, through being in the right place at the right time, through advantages of race and gender that were invisible to him but very real. He was white in a society where being white conferred automatic advantages. He was male in a time when women were largely excluded from public life and independent economic activity. These things do not negate his achievements, but they complicate the simple narrative of success through merit alone. We also remember Franklin the inventor, the practical genius who gave us the lightning rod and bifocals and the Franklin stove. This Franklin represents American pragmatism, the idea that knowledge should serve useful purposes, that theory must connect to practice, that the test of an idea is whether it works. It is an important tradition in American thought, though it can sometimes degenerate into anti-intellectualism, into impatience with abstract thought and theoretical knowledge. Then there is Franklin the statesman, the diplomat who helped secure French support for American independence, the elder statesman at the Constitutional Convention. This Franklin represents wisdom, experience, the willingness to compromise for the greater good. He is the Franklin who urges his fellow delegates to support the Constitution despite its flaws, who understands that perfect is the enemy of good, who recognizes that politics is the art of the possible. But perhaps most important is Franklin the curious mind, the person who never stopped asking questions, never stopped learning, never stopped trying to understand how things work. This is the Franklin who taught himself French and Italian and natural philosophy. The Franklin who invented new words and proposed new theories and conducted experiments. The Franklin who, at 84, weak and dying, was still curious about the world, still engaged with ideas, still thinking and questioning. This quality, this insatiable curiosity, may be Franklin's most valuable legacy. In an age of rigid dogmas and inherited wisdom, Franklin insisted on testing ideas, on examining assumptions, on following evidence wherever it led. He was willing to change his mind when presented with better arguments or new facts. He was willing to admit ignorance and uncertainty. He understood that human knowledge is always provisional, always subject to revision, that the wise person holds conclusions tentatively and remains open to learning. Franklin's life also teaches us about the relationship between private virtue and public service. He believed that personal character mattered, that self-discipline and honesty and industry made for better citizens. But he also believed that virtue must extend beyond the individual, that we have obligations to our community, that the purpose of self-improvement is not just personal success, but the ability to contribute to the common good. This is why Franklin spent so much time and energy creating institutions, libraries, fire companies, hospitals, schools, learned societies, He understood that individual achievement means little if the society around you is dysfunctional, that creating good institutions is how you make progress permanent, how you ensure that the benefits of knowledge and wisdom extend beyond a single generation. And finally, Franklin's life teaches us that moral growth is possible, that we are not prisoners of the prejudices we inherit, that reflection and experience can lead us to better understanding. The young Franklin who accepted slavery evolved into the old Franklin who opposed it. The young Franklin who was sometimes arrogant and self-promoting matured into the elder statesman who could laugh at himself and acknowledge his limitations. This capacity for growth, for moral development, may be the most hopeful lesson of Franklin's life. We are not fixed in our views, not bound to repeat the mistakes of our past, not condemned to defend the indefensible simply because we once believed it. We can change, we can become better, and if we are lucky and live long enough, we may even become wise. Benjamin Franklin died in 1790, but the institutions he created endure. The Library Company of Philadelphia still operates. The University of Pennsylvania still educates students. The American Philosophical Society still promotes useful knowledge. The postal system he helped organize has grown into a vast network connecting the nation. The lightning rods he invented still protect buildings from fire. More importantly, the ideas he championed still resonate. The belief in human improvability. The conviction that knowledge should serve the common good. The insistence that all people, regardless of birth, deserve the opportunity to develop their talents. The understanding that a free society requires educated citizens and robust institutions. The recognition that virtue is not just about personal purity, but about service to others. These ideas are not uniquely Franklin's, but he embodied them, lived them, demonstrated through his own life that they were not just abstractions, but practical guides for how to live. A printer who taught himself to be a scientist, a businessman who became a statesman, a colonial subject who helped birth a nation, a poor boy who proved that talent and effort and virtue matter more than birth and wealth. This is Benjamin Franklin, the man who flew a kite in a thunderstorm and changed the world. The man who wrote that either we must write something worth reading or do something worth writing. The man who did both, who left us not just the story of an extraordinary life, but the institutions, inventions, and ideas that make our lives better today. His story reminds us of what is possible when curiosity meets opportunity, when talent meets determination, when individual ambition aligns with public service. It is a story worth remembering, worth retelling, worth learning from. Because the questions Franklin asked, the problems he tried to solve, the values he championed, are still with us, still urgent, still demanding our attention and our best efforts. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Franklin wrote it, perhaps believed it, certainly sold it to generations of Americans through Poor Richard's Almanac. But the real wisdom in Franklin's life is not in any single aphorism, however clever. It is in the pattern of a life lived with purpose and curiosity, with ambition tempered by service, with success that never lost sight of the common good. That is the Franklin worth remembering. That is the Franklin who still, more than 2 centuries after his death, has something to teach us about how to live.